are useful for you. Obviously, the column is that long thing that's equivalent to a leg, rounded. And the entablature includes a whole range of things there. It is that flat support for the pediment, the triangular piece up above. And the entablature will contain a frieze. You see that term over on the right side. And the friezes vary depending upon the orders. The one with the triglyph, those vertical pieces, and then a blank one are typical of the Doric order, but not for some of the others. So we will talk about some of these things as we go along, but this is really very elementary. Now you'll see that the pilaster that I've been mentioning, that flat piece against a wall that's articulated with the classical orders, is exemplified by this flat area behind the fluted columns of the Doric order in the example on the right. And that is flat against the wall, and we've been seeing Brunelleschi use that a lot. So keep these things in mind as we go along. I'm not going to test you on them, but if you learn them and can use them, then I give you credit for it. Okay, so it depends on your initiative. And if enough of your colleagues do it and they get more points, why then in the end it hurts if you don't bother. So that's my logic anyway. All right, now today I want to turn to painting, if I can ever get things going here, and share with you some fun material that I've been learning, as it were. There's, every time I teach a course like this, there's a whole cycle of other publications, or I get going on one thing or another, and there is a very interesting conference at Harvard's ITAHI, which is north of Settignano, there in outside of Florence, and a conference actually early on in the 2000s, 2003, I think, concerning the Brancacci Chapel. And it's gotten me going looking again at some of the things that we're going to be talking about in the next couple of days. So let me see here. I guess I have to put in my thumb drive. What we can talk about. I mentioned to you before that I'm a contextualist. That is, I'm really interested in what the historical circumstances are surrounding works of art. And I will be talking about aesthetic issues, but I'm not as preoccupied with that as some of my colleagues are. Okay, let's see here. Oh, shoot. Okay, so I don't usually use notes with you, but I may here for at least a couple of things, and I may also bring some other things back on Friday that are related to our topics here today. But remember, we are going to be moving in terms of talking about style from a really a late medieval orientation to a newer style, taking into account some of these innovations that we've seen them going on in sculpture and in architecture. The thing of it is that the matters are not quite as clear as people used to argue. Friedrich Antal established a thesis early on in the 20th century that there's an absolute break and that you can see strong contrast between what we call the International Gothic style and this new style particularly exemplified by the artist Masaccio, whom I'm going to talk about on Friday. But it's not quite as clear as all that, and so I do want to begin today. We're going to be talking about a group of people, Lorenzo Monico, or the monk Lorenzo, or Leonardo, I suppose you could say. Lorenzo Monico, in fact, was a Carthusian, although he in fact ended up kind of affiliated with the order. And he is living from the last quarter of the 14th century into the first quarter of the 15th century. And he does exemplify this international Gothic style. He had some of the major commissions at the very beginning of the 15th century, as we will see. It is Gentile da Fabriano who's gone through quite a stretch of reinterpretation, and I do share that. He is a lot more innovative than somebody like Antal first argued, and we'll be able to see why. And what is so very interesting, and that I've gotten really quite preoccupied with here the last 48 hours, has been the circle of people for whom he painted. I've always been acquainted with some of them, but it's a really fascinating group that I want to touch on a little bit. Masolino, or Little Tom, or Delicate Tom, depending on how you want to translate that, he's the small one. I-N-O suffix means small. And Masaccio is the big guy. Now you can call him clumsy and big, or you can just call him Big Tom versus Little Tom. But these are nicknames. As you can see, they have these whole long other names. Usually they are the son of so-and-so, or they are from such and such a place. And so those of us who do not grow up in this culture shorten things to Tom, and we've got a Little Tom and a Big Tom. Well, the first one is the one who gets the commission for the famous Brancacci Chapel that we're going to be talking about. And he's a kind of interesting transitional figure. He's closer to Gentile, although not quite the same sort of things, as we will see. And it turns out that this fellow is joining the workshop after the first year or so, and then Masolino gets a better job someplace else, in fact in Hungary, and he leaves, and Masaccio stays. And then they both get together again and they go to Rome. And so the chapel remains unfinished until toward the end of the 15th century. So it's a project that we won't be able to see to its completion this week, but we will see some very interesting things that go on there. The Brancacci Chapel is always taught in a survey class, but I want to spend more time on what is actually going on there. So my preoccupations today are this transition from this international Gothic style as it confronts, in some degree, this revolution that's been going on in sculpture, but also in architecture. And then Gentile is going to actually bring some qualifiers into this. It's not as easy as a sort of black and white circumstance. So I didn't have specific extra readings for you here today, but we've got a number of commissions, and we've got a whole group of things that over the course of today and Friday we will be talking about. The ones that I'm particularly interested in you knowing is this first one by Lorenzo Monico. I see I've left off Lorenzo's name. That's not well done. Okay, Lorenzo's the first one we're going to look at. Then we'll look at Gentile. And then we'll look at a Masolino. We won't look at this until Friday. And then where we're wanting to spend between largely Friday, the Religious Art Commission in this private chapel of the Brancacci family. And they owned it They'd owned it from the 14th century. They were a family who'd been long involved in their neighborhood and in the church. But the one that we're most interested in is Felice, or Pappy, Pappy Brancati, who, interestingly enough, was a Florentine ambassador to Cairo. And it turns out that some recent scholars have actually been getting a hold of his report to the Florentine Senate when he got back. All of these, you'll remember that our regions of Italy function as independent governments. They're completely independent. This is not a nation state. And so when you send an ambassador to the Vatican or you send an ambassador to Cairo, you file a report later. And some of these reports are really insightful. So we have that, and we know that he was also exiled. And that's another sad story of the politics in Florence after these years. Well, let me start with a 14th century example of the coronation of the Virgin, because this is a frequently found theme, and it is in fact a primary altarpiece, a huge altarpiece. And you see this reconstruction? This is of the original Gothic frame with the coronation down here, a predella, that is the base, the foot of it. A second level up here with all kinds of narratives related to the religious story. And then at the very top, an image of Christ crucified, celebrated by angels. That's all been sawed apart and moved to various museums over the world. And the church itself is no longer standing. This is part of what its original facade looked like, but that's it. And so you have to reconstruct, and it's worth doing because it turns out that it was the church of San Pier Maggiore, and it was part of a convent for women, Benedictine, one of the oldest monastic orders, remember. And the Benedictine abbess, the woman in charge, was so important that when the first new Florentine bishop would be appointed, he would have to come over to the Benedictine convent and, in fact, go through a whole ceremony there before he could take office. She really had a lot of power. So this huge altarpiece, which stood on its high altar, had a lot of prestige in Florence. And in this period of time, so we're talking about the last quarter, the beginning of the last quarter, more or less, of the 14th century. And so when we turn to look at an example in the early 15th century, this kind of Gothic prototype is what was common at the time. Here's a reconstruction of the church as it once appeared to be in a print. That's another way you can reconstruct some of these destroyed sites subsequently. Well, this is the central portion of it, of Jacopo di Cione, and you can see how elaborate it is. Very elaborate dress here, robes worn by Christ and the Virgin, and a very elaborate hanging behind. And then all the saints gather in celebration and angels. It's really a very elaborate process. The new one that we're interested in by Lorenzo Monico is done for the Camel Days at Santa Maria degli Angeli, which you'll remember we talked about last time because Brunelleschi did a very experimental architectural construction for them. And the church facade, as it still remains, is over here. And this is where this group also had a great deal of money and commissioned its high altar, not for this building that Brunelleschi does, but for its main church. And this is the product of that major commission. Now, the date is easy to remember in many ways. It's 1414. And it is another one of these coronations. It's when Mary finally arrives in heaven. Remember, we saw Nani Tibanco showing her being lifted to heaven. Well, this is after she gets there, and she is crowned by her son, Christ. And here, as with Jacopo di Cione, there's a Gothic architectural ciborium or baldachin behind them. And they are basically up in heaven, as this great stretch of colorful stars suggests. This has been damaged because there was a tabernacle installed here for a time. But there are these great choirs of saints and angels and people who accompany this. It's an enormous celebration. And up here, an image of the blessing Christ and the Annunciation. So you've sort of got the beginning and the end of Mary's role in this religious story. You'll notice that the colors are very bright, very intense. Bright blues and pinks and this very stark yellow against the gold. And as a wonderful scholar who written on this some years ago would remark, you have to remember that it was on an altar lighted by candlelight. And that when you had a real ceremony, and so it picked up that gold, it picked up these bright colors. And if you look closely, and we might as well take John the Baptist, he's always easy to recognize with his big long beard. He looks very much like a relative of Lorenzo Ghiberti's St. John that we've already seen on Or San Michele. So here we have, once again, in this early period of time, a confirmation of the popularity of the International Gothic style, which you can see particularly easily in the drapery, the way the folds of the drapery move, and you can see John is over here with a very similar one, except that, of course, in paint, you can add to this wonderful lyrical quality these beautiful colors. So painting is behind, and it will stay behind because Lorenzo Monico continues to have the most important commissions. And if you look closely, you can see that the figures not only wear that kind of drapery, but also that they are elongated. They're stretched out. So if you did a proportionate relationship of head length, you'd probably have maybe 10 heads height versus an ideal of 8, as we'll see later on. So she's very tall, so is he. Very, very long, almost boneless fingers, this kind of thing. And again, very elegant sort of happening here. Let me show you some of the images in the predella, because they will be a very interesting contrast subsequently with Gentile. Here we have the birth of Christ in, remember that shed where you've got the cow and the donkey, and you've got Joseph, then you've got Mary, and here you see that Lorenzo handles shadow by more what we call saturated colors. If you had a tube, they didn't. They did it all by grinding the various minerals and herbs and other things that they used for color. But in this case, he takes his most intense saturated color and puts it behind and on the right leg, which is in his shadow, and the leg that's closest to us and in the greatest light, he paints with more white. So he heightens that color with white. In other words, the inclusion of a dark hue, a black, or a dark value of black or some other color that will dull that down is not what it does. And that's also a way that International Gothic handled color, at least in a good part of the time. Notice that the holy light are these striations of gold that has been added, and that's true up here where the angel arrives to tell the shepherds this miracle has just happened and they should make their way down here and pay their respects. And you've got various holy signs of angels. These are crowds of angels. It's kind of hard to see them. And then, of course, we've got landscape, which, if we look at a handbook that was published about 100 years before. Actually, it was published about this time, but written much earlier. by Cennino Cennini on how you do these things. He'll say for rocks, you want to go out and get a pile of rocks and pile them up in your studio and copy them. And, well, this doesn't really look like a pile of rocks. On the other hand, maybe it does. In other words, it doesn't look as if he's been out looking at the landscape, but rather they're stereotypes for that. So if you can keep in mind the way he handles color, the way he handles proportion, the elongation of things, light is handled by striations of gold, although he is trying to show you some reflection of light here. So he's not completely without observations. And the shed for the area here does go back a little bit, although not a lot. He also does on this predella the story of Saint Benedict reviving a monk, and you can see for the predella, he simplified that composition a lot. This was a fresco in Florence from the late 14th century that shows the same thing at the monastery of San Miniato. And so he's following in a number of well-recognized traditions. This is another example you do not have to know, but shows you particularly well the elongation. The very bright colors, here again he's showing it more saturated for shadowing. Up here he does have a little bit of darker value, but not a lot. Very, very long figure, small head for that proportion. He still has those wonderful Gothic rhythmic folds. He's still got our plain kind of rock formation. This being the adoration of the Magi, not the shepherds, shows us a number of exotic types, since after all, the Magi were coming from places like Yemen and the whole Gulf area where they were bringing spices, remember, and myrrh and all kinds of exotic things in their special containers. And so the presence of Africans, remember I've mentioned the presence of the slave trade, which was largely Central Asian at this point. So we've got a number of sort of Islamic-looking characters here with their heads wrapped in turbans and their long beards. And it shows you this various kind of series of stereotypes of exotic folks. And again, you see the Gothic sort of setting. And he's having trouble with making things go back in space, although it's not too bad an approximation. And of course, they're that high value pink. The arrival of Gentile da Fabriano in Florence is something that's a very interesting phenomenon. He's an artist whose name indicates where he's from. It's like Leonardo da Vinci. You don't ever want to call him Fabriano because that's simply the town. So Joe from Chicago, you don't want to call Chicago, you call him Joe. And so Gentile is from the town of Fabriano, a famous place for making paper, still to this day. And he had been working in the northern part of the peninsula quite a bit. He is called to work for the newly elected pope. Remember, we had that burial area for the so-called anti-pope of John the 23rd that Michelozzo and Donatello work on for that tomb in the baptistry in Florence. And it turns out it's a very interesting political moment because the Council of Trent elects a new pope trying to unify this Christian church instead of having these other series of power centers. And it works out pretty well. A lot of the Florentines who were supporting the anti-pope agree to support Martin V. And the new pope comes to Florence on his way to Rome because the Council of Constance had been happening in southern Germany at Constance, at the lake up there. And then he makes his way to Florence, and Gentili arrives because he's been asked by the entourage of the Pope to come and do painting for him, and in fact he will join the Pope in Rome and do major painting at San Giovanni in Laterano. But critics think he arrives about the time the Pope does, 1419, 20, and I want to look at several early things before we look at the Adoration of the Magi, which is what I want you to know. He does, and this is not a terribly good representation, but if you get online for the National Gallery of Art in Washington, just go to nga.gov and type in Gentili da Fabriano, you'll get a series of things that come up. And they'll let you pull this up until you can really get some details. And it's a fascinating case in which we see an artist who clearly knows International Gothic. And you recognize that by this really very decorative kind of handling of the drapery. And you've got a kind of bucket fold here. But he also is an astute observer. Now, how much he takes into account the innovations that we already saw Donatello do in that relief sculpture of St. George is hard to say, but he's paying a close attention, and he comes already with very careful observations, certainly of fabric, and a fair amount of nature detail. But the thing that increasingly draws attention to his work is the way he can convey a sort of human presence. And you see this just a little bit here with the interchange between mother and child. They're still pretty tight-lipped and rosebud mouths, but the child is, you can't see this here, but you can pull it up on the website. He's pointing to the word M-A-T-E-R that's been embroidered on her collar, which means mother, of course. And you can't see it here either, but he's got a butterfly on a leash, a little thread. And so there are a number of very interesting details here, as well as a kind of Gothic inscription in Kufic letter writing down at the bottom. And there are also scratched into the gold a number of angels and other things that are really tough to see. So this is kind of what he does on his arrival in Florence. And then he goes through a series of commissions. And in fact, it's been proposed that the reason the Brancacci hired Mazzolino rather than Gentili da Fabriano was that he had so many commissions he couldn't do another one. And he was working for a circle of these very wealthy merchants, the guys who were in charge of the commission, let's say, for the John the Baptist on the Orsa Michele, or who were in charge of commissioning Ghiberti to do that set of doors for the baptistry. They were, by and large, involved in the cloth industry. Certainly, Felice Brancacci was a silk merchant, but so too were a number of others. And so increasingly, the ability of Gentili to show basically the business in what these people wore. Look at this very elaborately embroidered and handled material worn by St. Lawrence, or the garment worn by the Madonna, or the wrapping of the child. It's really quite extraordinary. A number of them were, like Felice Brancacci, sent out as ambassadors to Naples, to Milan, and very often these courts, which were still very oriented to a dominant authority and knights of armor and defense, would often knight these ambassadors. And so these men would come back. They were wealthy, they were involved in international trade, and they were aware of the kind of status and prestige of really this late medieval chivalric tradition, okay, and also represented very much by the French. And you see that here with this Saint Julian, where he's got his great big sword here, he's got his fancy belt, and then he's accompanied by Lawrence. So there are a variety of things here. Here's Lawrence's grill that he's martyred on. There are a number of things about an altarpiece like this, plus now even more sensibility on the part of the Christ child, who this time looks to Julian. He really smiles, and I've got a detail here finally that you can see a little bit better. See how much presence there is in that child? Can you see that? The eyes kind of light up, and he's really got a smile, and he seems directed, although maybe he's distracted by this little bird that's flying here. In any case, he's turned. You can still see this boneless, elongated hand that's typical of the International Gothic. But the child turns and holds onto her wrist in a very innovative kind of way. And she holds on to him pretty well with this hand, so that there are these interesting details. The more you start to look, the more you see. The Quarantese, I should say, is another very one of these wealthy mercantile families, and they commissioned a huge altarpiece from Gentile, and it has now been divided up. Originally, this figure would have been in the middle with a series of saints, including St. Nicholas, whom I want to show you some details for, very elaborately dressed. And again, look at this backdrop cloth, or cloth of honor as we call it, the drapery she sits on, the rug, the Christ child's outfit. You can tell these people really care how he's representing all of these different materials. And so this probably was the high altar for San Niccolò Oltrano, which celebrates Nicholas of Bari. So I'll show you one of the predella here in a minute. One of them, in fact, is a representation of pilgrims going to a tomb, probably of St. Nicholas. And this is often how these saints were acknowledged, and pilgrims, particularly those in need of cure or help, would go. And here in an older form of a church. One of the tiny scenes now down below this very elaborate altarpiece. Here's another one where St. Nicholas is rescuing passengers, and because so many of these men were involved in trade in the Mediterranean, representing a ship and the proper representation of folks on board was not a bad thing to know how to do. The representation of mermaids is a bit more mysterious as she flows along over here, but this too a small panel. So it's with this kind of background that the Strozzi family commissioned Gentile to do this painting, I Do Want You to Know, The Adoration of the Magi. And this one is dated. He writes his name and the date of May 1423. Not at all shy, remember, about showing himself. Remember, we've had Ghiberti doing his own portrait, and we've had others indicating that they're the artists. So what we have, it's still intact, is this very elaborate altarpiece, again with an Annunciation at the top, and Christ blessing, with some very elegant Old Testament figures here, David and Moses, and decorative flowers and details on the frame. So we're really lucky to have this original frame. The Strozzi coat of arms is over here, and then the predella, and you can see how he's paying attention to spatial relationships. I don't have the whole predella for the altarpiece we just looked at together, but here you do. So this is the center, and it goes all the way up here, of course, to Christ's blessing. And then at an angle over here, we've got the Nativity again. And over here, a little bit more ambiguously, we've got architecture visible from the other side with Christ's presentation in the temple. So you've got his birth, the flight into Egypt, and the presentation in the temple. The main altarpiece is following, to some degree, a traditional representation of what turns out to be a cavalcade. And there was a confraternity in Florence, again, one of these religious organizations that would draw a variety of people for religious service, but also social obligations, care of the poor, feeding of the poor. And every year on the 6th of January, which was the day of Epiphany, or the day when the Magi were supposed to have come, today it's still a gift-giving day in Italy, the Magi would, the Florentines, dress up as Magi and ride all across town to the monastery of San Marco. And so here they come in a cavalcade where you see them parading through to pay homage to the Christ child and the Virgin Mary, who is flanked by this rather fancily dressed serving woman. And you see over here in the background the very elaborately dressed Magi. You couldn't get any more elaborate than this. And the Strozzi were bankers, so they had the money to buy all these goods. And again, you get an example of the focus and attention on cloth making and also the international trade. Up here, others, some of whom are probably portraits, or so we believe, of members of the entourage. And there's some indication that he really does understand here by 23 many of the principles of perspective. His head is tipped up in such a way that he has to be pretty sophisticated to paint it in that what we call foreshortened way. And then we've got the monkeys and all the other exotic things. There aren't any Africans in this group, as far as I can tell, but there are camels and there are monkeys, and you see them going into the landscape where the rocks and all this background is not terribly naturalistic, but it's a lot better than what Lorenzo Monico had with those big chunks that had no relationship to observation at all. Here's a big castle up here on the hill, and a town, a city, as one finds in Tuscany up on the top of the hills. And here's the sea where they had to come by sea to do this. So we've got a very elaborate and very impressive altarpiece. Here you can see where he's written in what we would call really very good early handling of the Roman capital. They're clear, they're broad, they're spaced apart. This is a time when people would write, they'd often abbreviate things, and they'd often write in Gothic script. It's really tough to read. So we've got the work of Gentili, of Fabriano, and then he signs it 14, 1, 2, 3, 400, 20, two tens, 23, in the month of May. So you can't get much more precise than that. And here we have the details of Joseph and Mary, Christ child. He's paying attention, he's blessing, putting his hand on that bowl. Magi, the oldest one, comes first, and then they are increasingly younger. This is the youngest, most elegant looking young knight, he looks like. And here you see a detail of the landscape where you've got these cheetahs on the rumps of the horses riding along. They're all making their way past, and I just flew over these kinds of areas, olive trees planted in regular fashion, or grapevines, and the city up on the top of the hill. The predella here are very interesting to look at. If you contrast the Lorenzo Monico with those striations of gold, now you see Gentili really trying to show a lot more reflection of light. The holy light is recognized by those gold striations, but then there's this reflection onto the cave and onto the building, a better handling of space, so that you see how progressive he really is. Some of this had gone on with Taddeo Gaddi in the Baroncelli Chapel of the 14th century, but he was almost unique in handling this. The northern Europeans were experimenting with this sort of thing much earlier on. And this is a presentation in the temple where critics have noted and suggested this as a reminder of the Ospedale degli Innocenti, of which, by the way, almost all these men were members, because remember, it was the Silk Merchants Guild that had paid for that Ospedale, and for sure, Brancacci, Felice Brancacci was a member. So whether that's really the case, it looks pretty general to me. But you do have an effort to show something of the local place, and then you've got these really fashionably dressed lady here, one who's equivalent with these elegant men, and her serving lady over here to the right. And you can see by contrast with Lorenzo Monico how very different the Gentili really is. So this is what's going on. Gentili really does introduce a number of new elements, and when we turn to look at Masolino, who was available to help Felice Brancacci do this chapel, where Gentili was not, we see a man who's somewhere closer to Gentili probably than Lorenzo, but who's still doing a kind of transitional art. You can see here with a Madonna and Child of 1423. Still very much of that international Gothic, although more of that immediate personal affection that Gentili was able to do. So we're talking about pretty fine degrees of refinement. This is also probably an Annunciation done before he works on the Brancacci Chapel, 1420s, for another of the Guardini, for another family of this wealthy mercantile group, where you again have the very elaborate textiles being shown, some of the inlaid marble work that was typical in Middle Eastern places, and an elongated Virgin here with architecture that, yes, maybe it alludes to Brunelleschi, but badly proportioned, and the perspective doesn't quite work. He's experimenting with it. All right. I'll introduce the Brancacci Chapel in a moment, but here is what some people think Masaccio looked like. And there is a portrait of this fellow in the chapel that a lot of people think might be he. He doesn't live very long, 27 years, and he creates this revolution just in the 20s. Because it turns out there's, in recent years, been discovered what is believed by many to be an early triptych by Masaccio, and it too shares a fair number of elements with the International Gothic, although a kind of bluntness here in the child chewing on his fingers that you probably wouldn't get Gentili to do. And there's some effort here to show recession in the architecture of the throne, intended here for this church out in one of the rural areas, not very far from where Masaccio actually grew up. And this is a slightly better image of it that you do not have to know. One other image that I will come back to toward the end of the course is this extremely interesting Madonna Child with St. Anne, maybe done before the Brancacci Chapel, where the two men are working together. It's hard to say, or during that time. It shows the Virgin Mary's mother, Anne, as the older woman, done, we think, by Masolino. And then Masaccio comes with this figure and this much heavier child. The angels are probably Masolino, although some critics have been arguing he's been looking pretty carefully at Gentili, so more believable than they used to be. And they're all seated all together because, of course, each one is born of the one on whose lap she's sitting. So Christ is born of the Virgin, and the Virgin is born of Anne, and they're all put in this tight composition. And here, by contrast, you can see how much more direct Masaccio is in his handling of the Madonna and Child than, let's say, Lorenzo Monico. Okay, everybody can see that, I hope. I couldn't resist. There's one other that's been found. It's very tiny, so tiny that the Germans could slip it away and steal it during World War II. Done probably by 1426, where Solito is the name of this Madonna because she's tickling the Christ child here, which is causing his little coral necklace to swing over on this side, though she's looking rather somber. All right, so the Brancacci Chapel, I must at least quickly introduce you to, and we'll come back next time. It is in the Carmelite Monastery Church, and it's over in this other side of the Arno again. This is where the San Nicolo is. It's over here on this side. And generally speaking, this is an area known, here's our church, and it's not very far from Santo Spirito. This is an area known for a lot of people on the poorer side of the economic spectrum. I mean, it's not isolated that way. The wealthy are living over here too, but there are a lot of craftspeople over here. And the chapel, as we have it today, is restored in rather recent years, 18th century ceiling, and an early altarpiece that seems to have been installed here in the 1440s, or maybe 10 or 15 years after the chapel was completed, and in the restorations, framing of this area has been discovered. Well, Masolino and Masaccio both work on this for Felice of Brancacci, who just come back from Cairo, and it is dedicated to the St. Peter, which raises also a lot of questions among critics. And we will come back next time and talk about this because Masolino does this first level and this painting, and then this Adam and Eve. Masaccio does this side, whoops, there and up here and over here and down here. This is Masolino also. So they divide it up, and we'll come back and see just what great changes begin to occur here. Everything all comes together. All right, well, I'm a little behind, but I'll catch up next time.